Także mam wielki zaszczyt i ogromną przyjemność zaprosić Państwa do wysłuchania dzisiejszego wykładu.
I think we will stand actually. It's much easier if I feel I'm talking to everyone. Is that all right with you?
Yes, yes.
Well, first of all, I want to say how delighted I am to be here in Krakow again, or Krakow, I think it is. And thank you so much to Edita for inviting me. So, of the many crises that are going on in England at the moment, one in particular is that of the relationship between the crucial, usually troubled, transitional relationship between childhood and adulthood, that is, adolescence, and the increasingly severe demands of the social, cultural, and in particular of the educational system. You may want to discuss this later. This is the era of league tables, records of the relative successes of schools in relation to young pupils' grades in exams. Naturally, a school's place in the league relates to their status and thus to financial support. Moreover, some subjects are considered much more valuable than others, especially in terms of access to better universities. The school curriculum thus tends to undervalue, for example, art, music, sport, even foreign languages, in favour of science subjects, IT, etc. The cognitive tends to be valued far more highly than the psychological or the emotional. Oh, and sorry, there's an epigraph that I didn't mention. It's from a prayer for old age, funnily enough, but that relates to the fact that I think adolescent states of mind belong in every age, in fact. Prayer for old age. God guard me from the thoughts men think in the mind alone. He who sings the lasting song thinks in a marrow bone.
Ten wiersz na początek, do którego odnosi się Margot, to jest wiersz Yatesa i ta pierwsza strofa jego w tłumaczeniu Barańczaka brzmi tak. Ustrzeż mnie, Boże, od tych myśli, co tylko w mózgu goszczą. Kto śpiewa pieśń naprawdę trwałą, ten myśli szpikiem i kością. Spośród wielu kryzysów toczących się obecnie w Anglii, jeden szczególnie dotyka kwestii zawsze trudnej i kłopotliwej w adolescencji, relacji pomiędzy tym, co dziecięce, a tym, co dorosłe. Staje się to trudne zwłaszcza w obliczu rosnących wymagań społeczeństwa, kultury, a przede wszystkim systemu edukacji. Tutaj Margot dodała, że o tym możemy dyskutować później, że będziemy chcieli. Oczywiście pozycja szkoły w rankingu wiąże się ze statusem, a zatem i z finansowymi zasobami. Co więcej, także niektóre przedmioty uważane są za bardziej wartościowe od innych, ponieważ gwarantują dostęp do lepszych uniwersytetów. Szkolne zestawienia mają tendencję, by nie doceniać dziedzin takich jak muzyka, sztuka, sport, a nawet języki obce, przedkładając wyżej nauki ścisłe czy informatykę. To, co poznawcze, wydaje się być cenione wyżej niż to, co emocjonalne.
As many of you will know, a long-term preoccupation of mine has been that of how an individual develops, how somebody grows up on the inside, especially on the inside as well as on the outside. More recently, I've been concentrating on adolescent states of mind, and in particular, how those states link with the processes of mental and emotional development from the very beginning, and what, as you've just heard, Yates calls thinking in the marrow bone.
Jak wiele z obecnych tu osób zapewne wie, od dawna zajmuje mnie rozwój jednostki. To jak ktoś dorasta, zarówno wewnętrznie, psychologicznie i emocjonalnie, jak i na zewnątrz. Ostatnio koncentrowałam się na stanach umysłu, a szczególnie na tym, jak stany te wiążą się od samego początku z procesem umysłowego i emocjonalnego rozwoju, z tym, co Yates nazywa szpikiem kości. Teraz przechodzimy już do
So a chapter on learning does belong at the heart of a book about adolescence, a book focused on the ordinary ways in which a person may really grow up. The aim is to differentiate between the sorts of thinking and knowing that contribute to character strength and the capacity to think creatively, to become oneself, or oneself, and those that encourage the mere proliferation of qualifications and expertise, the sort of learning that may measure external success without increasing internal growth, the bane of the current system. Of concern are not so much matters of social goals and priorities, but the most specific and personal of issues, the kinds of identification to which a child has been drawn from the very first. So adolescence doesn't begin at 12, it begins at the very first. In simple terms, in the psychodynamic way of thinking, the question may be posed like this. Do the child's primary identifications seem to be of an adhesive and sticky, projective or an introjective kind? I'll go back to these terms in the course of the paper. There will, of course, be constant movement between these, but in any one child, it's usually possible to discern the underlying predominance of one mode over another, despite shifts and changes along the way. It tends to be the predominance of one of these modes over others that determines whether learning takes place by way of imitation, of a mimicking, parroting, as I say, adhesive kind, or by the child's anxiously seeking to be someone that he or she isn't, projectively acting in role, or even experiencing the self as if it is the other, or by the child's resiliently seeking understanding by engaging with his or her own experience of a secure inner sense of self, derived from a capacity for introjective identification with good and thoughtful qualities of mind. Now, Donald Meltzer, an English psychoanalyst, described introjection, which I'll talk about later, as the most important and the most mysterious concept in psychoanalysis.
Donald Meltzer opisał introjekcję jako najbardziej tajemniczy, najbardziej niezwykły proces w psychoanalizie, ideę psychoanalityczną.
The importance of the link between these broad types of identification and the different learning modes that are embedded within them. That link both characterizes and illuminates fundamental developmental processes. And my present task is to try to explore the origin and nature of different kinds of learning and the possible consequences for the personality when one mode takes precedence over the other. Again in a bracket. I think this is recognizable to all of us, not just in terms of our cases or our own children, but surely of ourselves. And I feel it's absolutely central to how we've all grown up in some way or other.
Myślę, że to sprawa, która ma znaczenie dla nas wszystkich, nie tylko ze względu na naszych pacjentów, żeby zrozumieć, w jaki sposób dorastamy.
So I'm going to give you a few dreams, the dreams of 3 adolescents in treatment, because they may lend definition and clarification, however schematically, to the kinds of identification in question. In the first example, the adhesive mode seems to have predominated from early on and seriously to have inhibited development. In the second example, a more projective mode would also seem significantly to have impeded emotional growth. The third example, by contrast, offers some evidence of early adhesive and projective tendencies yielding to a more introjective capacity with a consequent enrichment of the personality. Now, the first patient, I'll call him John, was 19 when he began therapy. He was the son of a successful writer. His dream would be seen to characterize the type of identification in which it may look as though development is occurring, but in fact, the development is very superficial, offering little genuine internal support, almost a caricature of a young adult. My own view is that adolescence doesn't stop at 18 or 21. It goes well up to about 30 and often beyond. But this will be very recognisable, I think. John's primary identification was one of slavish observation, imitation, and mimicry of the social behaviour and appearance of those to whom he was very close, especially his father. He described himself, with no apparent self-consciousness, as dressing, speaking, gesturing, and behaving exactly like his father. It was as if he needed somehow to be stuck on to the older man's skin, surface to surface, as Esther Bick would describe it. I can talk about her later. He adopted his parents' tastes, their way of life, their interests and goals. He was frequently overwhelmed with panic at the idea of having to make an independent choice. He was frequently overwhelmed with panic, as I say, and not surprisingly, when he began therapy, his personality did seem to me rather shallow and two-dimensional. At this point, his state was one of total dependence upon the thoughts and views of those few to whom he attached himself. Now, he had, in a sense, survived his adolescent years by appearing to be mature, although perhaps excessively self-preoccupied and lacking in joie de vivre. And also without much genuine feeling for others, not much empathy. His behaviour seemed to be socially adapted at the expense of any internal development. He'd had no meaningful sexual relationships or friendships, and appeared to have very little capacity to think for himself, getting through the educational system by rote learning, by the parroting technique I've mentioned, of the in one ear, out the other variety. I must say I recognise that. This method left him with little feeling of confidence in having any knowledge of his own, with the result that the knowledge that he did acquire made no lasting impact on his personality. We could call him a teenage isolate, presenting to the world a rather fraudulent appearance of stability, one that on the whole attracted little attention from the adults concerned. In fact, whenever I hear that an adolescent is getting on with his work and sitting quietly at the back of the classroom not causing trouble, I think this is trouble.
Za każdym razem, kiedy słyszę, że adolescent siedzi spokojnie z tyłu w pewnej ławce i nie sprawia żadnych kłopotów, zaczynam myśleć, że to jest kłopot.
So he only came to anyone's notice when he started to become seriously depressed, at the point at which his age meant, educationally at least, that he had to take steps to separate from his family. And you may know Freud's notion of there being serious development in adolescence that lies in separation and individuation. He had not separated. Separation was felt to be both traumatic and damaging, not only to himself, but also, in his mind, to the individuals from whom he was having to tear himself free. And interestingly, he became morbidly preoccupied at this time with the idea of his father's death. The characteristic defence against this kind of primitive sense of being torn apart is familiar in the notion, Esther Bick's notion, of a kind of second skin defence. It could be in a younger child, the sort of child who can't take off his coat because he only feels he can be himself if he's properly wrapped up in his jacket or his coat.
Znam kiedyś małe dziecko, które stanowczo odmawiało zdjęcia swojego płaszczyka, kurteczki. Cały czas było takie jego owinięte, ponieważ miało poczucie, że jeśli go zdejmie, stanie się coś strasznego.
So in John's case, the mode seemed to be a muscular one. He was a brilliant sportsman, as his father had been, and he trained excessively, but in no other area of his life did he excel. A requirement of any response beyond the most cliched and conventional provoked acute anxiety. We may want to discuss later children with ADHD because it's very difficult to determine the difference between the two. The following dream epitomizes, I think, his predicament and focuses his aversion to exposing himself to the painful process of actually growing up, with the attendant anguish of separation and the risk of change. In the dream, I'll quote, "I was a child gazing at a Harley-Davidson motorcycle with associations closely linked to his father, which stood on the summit of a mountain outlined against the gorgeous hues of the evening sky." Now remember, his father was a writer, so he's talking about the gorgeous hues of the evening sky. "Between me and the bike, which I desperately wanted to reach, lay a dark mountainside. I would have to ascend a steep, drizzly and forbidding road, winding its way up towards the top. I had a powerful sense of wanting just to be raised up so that I could simply be the motorbike." John longed, in other words, just to be his father, to be grown up like him, having eliminated the alarming and hazardous, winding, forbidding adolescent process. He wanted to evade the risky business of separation, which he would have to undergo in order to become himself and ride free wherever he chose. His adhesive mode of identifying had put in abeyance any genuine growing up. His unconscious desire was to bypass the problems of adolescence, or rather perhaps to deny the adolescent state of mind altogether, in favour of a pseudo-adult one, to deny, that is, the function of the adolescent transition in the process of maturing into one's own as opposed to a borrowed identity. The fact that in the dream he was still a child suggests that the nature of his learning process had, from early on, blocked the path to becoming himself, or oneself, as opposed to being the look-alike version of his father. So while outwardly nearly a grown-up, inwardly he had hardly begun. Historically, psychoanalysis has always concerned itself with matters of learning and thinking, but to my mind, the focus has impressively changed over the decades to the point where theories of thinking have now become central to our present ways of understanding the individual as a whole person. With Freud, thought, or the ability to think, was roughly speaking regarded as a way of bridging the frustrating gap between the moment a need is felt and the point at which the appropriate action satisfies it. By contrast, Klein's early concerns centred on much broader and more personal matters of a child's education, in fact, on intellectual inhibition and emotional blocks to learning. She was interested in how psychoanalysis and education might together contribute to the blossoming of the personality in all its dimensions. She and her friend and colleague, Susan Isaacs, who for several years ran the progressive Malting House School in Cambridge, in Branchester, wrote about the way in which intellectual and creative capacities are inhibited, in particular by anxiety, and also quite specifically by the repression of sexual curiosity. Their view was that the child can only learn from engaging with his or her own real experiences, and that the educator should seek to support those experiences rather than to stand in the way of them. That goes back to my original description of the crisis in England at the moment. Now, underlying these views was the notion that the child's need to know and understand the truth about himself or herself and their experience of the world, initially represented by the mother's body and mind, the very first experience they have, mother, as a babe in arms, is an impulse so fundamental that it almost amounted to an instinct, and Klein actually called it the epistemophilic impulse or instinct. She thought of it as originating in the infant's unconscious desire to fathom the contents of the mother's body. And she introduced a central distinction which later acquired very significant dimensions, a distinction between intrusive curiosity, the child who has to know, yes, but what? Or yes, I know, yes, I know. It's stimulated by a voyeuristic need to know in order to master and control, and a more enlightened desire to get to know and understand, something more akin to a thirst for knowledge in the interests of growth rather than mastery. These ideas raise questions as to the degree to which learning and finding out would encourage or, by contrast, inhibit the developing self, whether learning would be in the service of genuine growth of the mind, or would function as a kind of defensive prop for the more timid self, whether or not at root, in other words, learning was an emotional experience. Well, such questions became fundamental to Bjorn's way of conceptualizing these matters. His theory of thinking put emotionality at the psychoanalytic heart of things. New idea. Well, new to psychoanalysis, not new to philosophical thinkers across the ages.